If I had to compile a list of chapters that had the most impact on how Dead by Daylight is played today, it would definitely include the Left Behind chapter, because it gave us borrowed time. It's one of Bill Overback's teachable perks. In its original form, it activated for 20 seconds when you unhooked a teammate inside the killer's terror radius. During that time, both of you could tank one hit that would normally put you in the dying state. That would trigger a 40-second bleed-out timer indicated by a black and white screen and a diminishing white bar under your character's icon. Any subsequent damage would make you go down. To stop the timer and return to the standard injured state, you had to heal for 1 health state by any means. If you failed to do that before the timer ran out, you would automatically go down. As you've probably already figured out, we're basically talking about the first iteration of the endurance and deep wound status effect. The reason borrowed time was added to the game was to address the ever-growing complaints from survivors about tunneling, which at that time was absolutely out of control. There was no such thing as temporary post-unhook endurance, which meant that unless your teammate took a hit for you, the killer could down you again immediately after you got unhooked. The only thing that could help you in that situation was Decisive Strike. At that time, it activated right at the start of the match and remained active until you chose to use it, for example, until the killer wanted to tunnel you. But the problem was that it was very unreliable as an anti-tunneling tool. First of all, to use it immediately after getting picked up, you had to be the Obsession. Non-Obsession players had to fill 35% of their wiggle bar to make the skill check appear, which was physically impossible if you went down close to the hook. But even as the Obsession, the result wasn't guaranteed. Back then, the skill check appeared much later than today, not during the picking up animation, but after it finished. This delay allowed the killer to walk a couple of steps toward the hook, drop you before the audio cue for the skill check even played, pick you up again, and repeat it until you eventually ended up on the hook. In fact, they could easily ensure they wouldn't have to carry you anywhere at all. Until patch 2.2.0, survivors weren't immune to taking damage while being unhooked. That meant the killer could hit you while unhooking was still in progress, and that would put you down before you even had a chance to step away from the hook. With that in mind, survivors absolutely needed a strong anti-tunneling tool, and borrowed time became exactly that. With it, getting unhooked right in front of the killer no longer meant a death sentence. Thanks to the extra hit, it was impossible for the killer to down you before you made it to a pallet or window where you could put up a fight. The same went for the Unhooker, who no longer felt like they were in a suicide mission. Before borrowed time, if you tried to unhook against a hardcore camper, 9 times out of 10 it meant taking your teammate's spot on the hook. Now, as long as you didn't come to the hook injured, that simply wasn't the case, because including the BT hit, the killer had to power through 3 hell states to down you. And if both survivors coordinated and started taking hits for each other, it allowed them to safely make it out of some of the nastiest spots in the game, like the basement and the main building on Suffocation Pit. That said, it wasn't really surprising that borrowed time took the game by storm soon after its introduction. It quickly reached the point where it became virtually impossible to find a lobby where all 4 survivors weren't running it. A big factor in that was that the Left Behind chapter was free, so when it dropped, the only thing standing between survivors and this perk was roughly 1.5 million blood points needed to unlock it. However, that doesn't mean borrowed time didn't have its flaws. For starters, just like the aforementioned Decisive Strike, it was a single-use perk. Once it did its job, it deactivated for the rest of the match and there was no way to get it back. That meant that if you wanted consistent protection against tunneling throughout the match, 1 or 2 survivors running it weren't enough. You needed all 4 to make sure the killer couldn't just eat a couple of extra hits and then default right back to tunneling. Another issue was that if you unhooked a survivor inside the terror radius but the killer chose not to tunnel, borrowed time would still be considered successfully used, even though it never actually provided any anti-tunneling value. Combined with it being single-use, this made it very easy to waste. The killer could be chasing a completely different survivor, but even if their terror radius barely grazed you while you were unhooking, you could kiss the perk goodbye. Next, borrowed time was pretty easy to bypass. Since its activation was tied to the terror radius, all the killer had to do was walk away from the hook far enough and wait for someone to come for the rescue. That wouldn't let it trigger, allowing the killer to go back and down the unhooked survivor without any problems. It worked especially well for the Hillbilly and the Nerfs, because their high mobility left survivors practically no chance to reach a safe spot. With stealth killers, it was even easier. Their lack of terror radius rendered borrowed time completely useless, and since the anti-camp meter didn't exist back then, they could stand right by the hook for the entire match and down the same survivor repeatedly the moment they got rescued. The biggest offender in this regard was the Wraith, because his power gave him full control over when to hide his terror radius. He was especially annoying to deal with if he brought his ghost add-on. Its original original version granted him permanent terror radius suppression after uncloaking, lasting until he moved or attacked. This eliminated the need to time his uncloaking to occur after the unhook. He could do it preemptively and borrowed time still wouldn't trigger. But to be honest, you didn't really need a dedicated stealth killer for this. The same effect could be achieved with regular characters as long as you had Insidious. In fact, as Bubba, you could achieve even more, because before his 2020 rework, he was absolutely unrivaled in his ability to camp and tunnel. One more thing that let killers partially counter borrowed time was insta-down perks and abilities. For some reason, it only protected you against them if you were injured. If you weren't, you'd go down like it wasn't even active. And that's weird, because according to the perk description, it was supposed to protect you against any damage that would put you in the dying state. Well, what can I say? I guess not any. Last but not least, unlike the deep wound timer, the original bleed out timer didn't stop when you were running, even if you were being chased. That meant that if the killer decided to commit to you after you took a borrowed time hit, it was GG for you. Even if you were the best looper in the world, you'd still die once the 40 seconds were up, giving the killer a cheesy and completely undeserved hook. The only way to pause the timer was by healing. As long as it was in progress, the timer wouldn't run, so if you had self-care or a medkit, you could delay your demise. Of course, with the constant pressure from the killer, you couldn't just start healing anywhere, you needed to be in a safe spot. Luckily, back then the game provided those in abundance. Old maps were absolutely flooded with pallets, and most of them were extremely safe. Wherever you were, there were almost always several nearby. Dropping one created a perfect setup for healing. If the killer tried to walk around the tile, you could simply vault to the other side and continue healing. If they decided to break the pallet, another one was waiting for you just a few meters away. But you didn't have to run there immediately. Back then, pallet breaking was so painfully slow that you could keep healing for about 2 extra seconds and still make it to the next pallet in time. Once you were there, you could drop it as well and buy yourself another 2 seconds, and you could repeat this over and over again, buying yourself more and more healing time. Given how fast healing was back then, it was actually possible to get rid of the bleed out completely that way. With self-care, botany knowledge, and resilience, healing one health state took just 14.9 seconds, which came out to about 8 pallets, or fewer if you managed to stun the killer a couple of times. With the fastest medkit and the 2 best healing speed add-ons, it was even faster, 8.6 seconds or 5 pallets tops. But even if that was still too slow for you, you could always resort to styptic agent or anti-hemorrhage syringe. In their original form, these add-ons healed you with a single button press, which earned them the nickname insta-heals. Styptic agent healed 1 health state, removing the bleed out timer, while anti-hemorrhage syringe healed 2, bringing you back to full health. The first changes to this perk came 6 months after its release with the introduction of Bubba. In that patch, the devs tried to tone it down slightly by reducing its active time to 15 seconds and the bleed out duration to 25 seconds. The first change wasn't really an issue. 15 seconds was still far too long for killers to wait out. In that time, a survivor could almost always find a tile to work with, even though by then the number of pallets on all maps had been significantly reduced. The second change, however, was a completely different story. Cutting the bleed out timer almost in half made killing survivors through it a genuinely viable option. 25 seconds was already shorter than what an average survivor could last in a chase, so unless you were confident you could catch them faster, which quite often you couldn't, there was simply no point in chasing them. It was easier to lock them in a tile and wait for the bleed out to finish, achieving the same result with less stress and effort. This change also severely limited survivors' ability to heal bleed out during a chase. Healing in such a short span of time was difficult in general, especially with slower options like base self-care without any supporting perks, but with half the pallets gone, it became nearly impossible, because the distance between the tiles grew so large that if you dropped a pallet and lingered behind it for even a second, there was a real risk you simply wouldn't make it to the next one in time. In the winter of 2018, shortly after the Peak's release, the devs returned with more nerfs to borrowed time. By that point, it had become obvious that letting the perk also protect the Unhooker was a bad idea. First, as nonsensical as it might sound for an anti-tunneling perk, it actually promoted tunneling. Since both survivors had an extra hit, it was always more beneficial for the killer to go after the one who had just been unhooked. Unless the Unhooker was already injured, downing and hooking the freshly unhooked survivor took less time and came with the strategic advantage of putting them one hook away from being sacrificed. Second, in the endgame, if a survivor was hooked near an open exit gate, borrowed time became essentially uncounterable. Once the unhook happened, no matter what the killer did, there was simply no way to stop the survivors from escaping. To address these issues, the devs changed borrowed time to affect only the unhooked survivor, turning it into a purely altruistic perk. But it wasn't that that bad, because to make up for it, they removed the single-use limitation from the perk, so now you could use BT as many times per match as you wanted. In December of 2018, Behavior released the Legion chapter, which introduced the Deep Wound and Endurance mechanics. Since these overlapped with how Borrowed Time worked, it only made sense to update the perk with them. Endurance took on the role of the perk's active time, while Deep Wound replaced the original Bleed Out mechanic. At first, this might seem like a purely technical update, but it actually had major gameplay implications, particularly the Deep Wound component, which turned out to be a massive buff. It no longer turned the screen black and white, instead only slightly darkening it, which obscured your vision far less. It also no longer required any healing perks or items to remove it on your own. Instead, it was cleared through Mending, a base kit action that works similarly to healing but exclusively for Deep Wound. But most importantly, the Deep Wound timer paused while you were in a chase. This meant that if the killer tried to tunnel you after a Borrowed Time hit, they could no longer rely on the timer to do the work for them. They actually had to catch you themselves. Or did they? The thing is that the first iteration of the Deep Wound timer only stopped while you were in a chase. Outside of a chase, no matter what you did, it kept ticking down. And you can probably see where this is going. Once again, stealth killers. The absence of a terror radius caused the game to think there was no chase, which allowed killers to exploit the timer just like before. In fact, even more efficiently, since with the introduction of Deep Wound, the timer had been reduced to 20 seconds. With a little trick, non-stealth killers could do the same. They would chase you while facing away from you, and because of the old day sloppy chase detection, this force stopped the chase, letting the timer run until it eventually killed you. Fixing this issue took the devs about a year, and in the end it was resolved by improving chase detection and making the timer pause while running and mending. Originally, Borrowed Time's Deep Wound timer was variable, depending on the tier: 10 seconds at tier 1, 15 at tier 2, and 20 at tier 3. But in early 2021, the devs standardized the Deep Wound timer to 20 seconds across all sources, including every tier of Borrowed Time. To keep the distinction between tiers, they moved the scaling to the endurance duration instead, setting it to 10, 12, and 15 seconds. In patch 4.7.0, the endurance duration was reduced to 8, 10, and 12 seconds. This drastically increased the number of killers trying to wait it out, to the point where it soon became the default behavior around freshly unhooked survivors. While this was a clear downside, it was ultimately worth it, because as compensation, the perk was changed to no longer require the presence of a terror radius to activate. From that point on, it triggered every time you unhooked someone, and there was absolutely nothing killers could do to prevent it, even if they stealthed or moved away from the hook. This marked Borrowed Time's golden age. Until 2022, its peak rate hovered around an absolutely mind-boggling 40%, which ultimately became the reason for its downfall. Though the way it died wasn't how strong perks usually die. Normally, when behavior notices that a perk is overperforming, they simply nerf it into the ground to make sure fewer people run it. This time, however, seeing how much survivors depended on Borrowed Time, they chose a different approach. In patch 6.1.0, also known as the first meta shakeup update, they turned it into a base kit mechanic, granting it to all survivors by default. Not in its full form though. Originally, after being unhooked, survivors stayed protected for only 5 seconds. During that time, they were also granted a 7% haste effect to help them get away from the hook faster. Both effects were cancelled if the survivor performed a conspicuous action, such as repairing, healing, sabotaging, and so on. To avoid overlapping effects, Borrowed Time was reworked to extend the base kit endurance and haste by 10 seconds. And honestly, this idea could have worked. After all, we're talking about 15 seconds of protection in total, which was essentially what the pre-4.7.0 version of Borrowed Time provided. But unfortunately, in patch 6.1.0, the devs also reworked Off the Record, and that completely overshadowed Borrowed Time. Originally, Off the Record activated for 80 seconds after you escaped from the hook, during which your aura could not be revealed to the killer and your grunts of pain were fully suppressed. The rework added the endurance effect to that, also lasting 80 seconds. This put Off the Record in direct opposition to Borrowed Time, and Borrowed Time simply didn't stand a chance. Not only because of the massive difference in endurance duration, but also because unlike Borrowed Time, Off the Record provided its value directly to the user, removing any dependence on the Unhooker's build. The final nail in the coffin of Borrowed Time came in patch 6.2.0, when the devs increased the duration of the new post-unhook protections to 10 seconds and the strength of haste to 10%. As a result, Borrowed Time's peak rate plummeted. In less than 2 months, it dropped to roughly 7%, and later fell even further, eventually flatlining at around 2%. By the end of 2025, borrowed time almost got a second life. This happened during the Crosso PTB as part of the tunneling and slugging reduction update. It consisted of a gazillion batshit crazy and tone-deaf changes. The one we're specifically interested in was the 30-second post-unhook endurance and haste. Basically behavior were like, we got away with base kit borrowed time, so why not base kit off the record? As a result, both borrowed time and off the record became redundant, so the devs had to change them. Off the record was nerfed. It no longer disabled once the exit gates were powered, and instead of granting endurance, it started suppressing survivor scratch marks. Borrowed time's bonus duration was increased to 12 seconds, which technically was a buff, but such a small one that it literally had no impact. The perk just went from being overshadowed by off the record to being overshadowed by base kit endurance and haste. But in the end, none of that mattered. The tunneling and slugging reduction update caused so much backlash from the community that the devs had no choice but to scrap it, along with almost all related perk changes, except off the record, which actually carried over to the live servers. And in my opinion, that was a huge W. Off the record was way too OP and never should have been that strong in the first place. And on top of that, it restored borrowed time's uniqueness and made its existence in the game feel justified again. Unfortunately, it didn't last long. Off the record was pretty popular, so its nerf simply couldn't go unnoticed. And apparently survivors were bitching about it so much that just 2 weeks later the devs caved and re-added the endurance effect. And you probably thought they swapped it back for the previously added scratch mark suppression effect. I mean, that'd be fair, but nope, they decided to keep that, essentially buffing an already mind-numbingly strong perk. They tried to somewhat balance it by cutting the perk's duration in half, but the resulting 40 seconds was still so much that I wonder if anyone even noticed something changed. In November 2025, the devs came back with yet another PTB and another attempt to shift the tunneling and slugging meta. It was about as unhinged as the previous one, and believe it or not, once again one of the proposed changes was the 30-second base kit endurance and haste. Guys, did I ever tell you what the definition of insanity is? Look, I don't want to be mean to whoever behavior suggested this, but my brother in Christ, what the f*** are you doing? You literally just tried this and got absolutely clowned on by the entire community. What possibly made you think this would work this time? And that wasn't even the only thing they did again. They also rolled back off the record to what it was in the previous PTB by removing its endurance effect and restoring its duration back to 80 seconds. But at least they tried something new with borrowed time. Now after unhooking someone, it allowed them to pick themselves up from the dying state for the next 100 seconds. While this was definitely better than a simple timer buff, it still wasn't great, because it made the perk even more situational. Just like before, whether the unhooked survivor could benefit from it depended entirely on whether the rescuer had it, which made it inferior to unbreakable. But on top of that, it now required the killer to actually slug you after downing, instead of hooking you immediately. But guess what? Once again, none of that mattered, because once again nobody liked the new changes, and behavior were forced to cancel them. All they managed to get away with was increasing the duration of the base kit endurance and haste to 12 seconds. And this brings us to the present day, where borrowed time is still completely useless. In fact, it's even more useless than before, because post and hook protections and off the record are stronger now. But that's most certainly not the end of the story. The devs are far from done with fixing tunneling and slugging. Whatever their final solution is gonna be, it's inevitably gonna make the current versions of borrowed time and off the record obsolete. And that means the devs will have to come back for them and rework them into something completely new. How many PTBs we're gonna have to survive before behavior interns actually make it happen is another question.